Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. I'm here today with my dear friend Jeff Ikler. We're talking about the No Longer Virtual Summit, which is always full of great takeaways. And it can actually be a little overwhelming in that I have so many ideas afterward. But one thing NLV offers that I've never experienced with other conferences is ongoing interaction and support long after I come home from the summit. In the planning stages, we talk about avoiding the after-conference hangover. It's that having lots of ideas following that attendance, but then no support to implement it when we get home. So a few weeks later, we may as well have not attended at all. So Jeff and I have been friends for over 10 years. We met on LinkedIn, and he hired me as his writing coach. He attended a few of the No Longer Virtual Summits and even came to visit me in Montana a couple summers ago. On a recent call, we talked about our inspirations ongoing from NLV in Austin in February in 2025 and had the idea to record a podcast about some of our more usable aha moments. So all the sessions were good, and we're just going to focus on two of them. Ruben Schwartz and Angela DeMarco's session on finding your target audience based on your values and the specific problems you solve for clients, which is basically becoming a big fish in a little pond instead of trying to compete in a large market. And a session hosted by Shannon Hernandez and Minette Riordan on identifying the best medium for your business development. Shannon calls this your content personality type, and she created a cool assessment to figure that out. So for today's podcast, Jeff and I will be discussing how we're implementing what we learned from those sessions, along with the questions we asked ourselves as we explored what we do and why we do it during No Longer Virtual. We're pretty sure you'll find some great takeaways too as you develop clarity in your career and your business. So Jeff, thanks so much for experimenting with me.
I'm looking forward to this. Just thinking back at on No Longer Virtual, and you're right. It's just there are so many takeaways, and one of the points I'm going to try to make here is that for myself, I often have to narrow it down to what's one really good thing I can remember about this, because otherwise it can be, for me, it can become overwhelming.
Yes, agreed. And that's part of why our regular virtual co-working sessions that we do almost every week has been so helpful to me, because I can focus on that one thing, and you were there too. So if I need help or brainstorming ideas or just a little more talking through and processing, I love that I can do that almost any given week.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I get a lot done then. It's nice just to block it out in the calendar and know that I've got a good 60 to 90 minutes there that I'm going to get done what I have to get done.
Agreed. So I know that my content personality type during that session was live and in person. And Minette and Shannon gave me some really good ideas on how to use that to help me with my business development. It's not always how I provide the services that I offer, but it is how I need to get people to care about the services that I offer. Do you remember what yours was, what your content personality type was?
Well, it had to do with actually the way I work best, which is in a reflection mode. And it's interesting. Every course that I've taken as an adult, I've tried to narrow it down to one consultant that I'm working with, as opposed to being in a big class, because I often find myself reflecting on what's being talked about, and I may miss threads of conversation because I'm back 3 or 4 lines, where we were before. So I do much better work, Sarah, when I can focus it on my own, in my domain, and then work with one other person like yourself.
Mm-hmm. I could totally see that. I could totally see that. So given what you know about yourself and maybe some of what you learned from both of those sessions, what was one takeaway from those sessions that you've been exploring since the summit?
So I think one of the big ones, and you touched on this, was especially what Ruben talked about. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him on the podcast afterwards, and we dug into this a little bit. His big point was, don't be afraid to narrow down onto a specific audience. And that was initially a struggle for me because I came from the publishing world where we were trying to cast as wide a net as we possibly could with our programs. We weren't leaving out this group or that group. We were selling to a general audience. But what Ruben really encourages, especially for solopreneurs, is narrow it down. See, check your values. What is it that you stand for? What problem are you trying to solve? And cast with a smaller net. It just, and speaking of, my experience in the publishing world, I remember once, Sarah, we were doing a presentation, and imagine that there's 100 people in a conference room, and we've got our PowerPoint up in back of us, and we're going through, 1,000 slides trying to educate the sales force on a new program. And one of the wily sales veteran goes like this. And he said, narrow this down to 1 to 2 things I need to tell my customers that's going to improve student learning. And because we were going through this litany of
Got right to the point.
we were going through this litany of features and benefits. And our reaction was, but we want to, and he said, if you stand for everything, you stand for nothing. And another sales rep said, shoot with a rifle, not with a shotgun. So you have to have this discipline that says, I can narrow down, I can meet a very specific targeted audience.
That is such a great reminder. It's such a great reminder. I know as a StrengthsFinder coach, I have to remind people who have a lot of those deep thinking and depth of thinking talents that what they need to make a decision is not the same amount of information that somebody else might need to make a decision. So I love that you got there. So you mentioned getting to interview Ruben Schwartz on your podcast, Getting Unstuck, Cultivating Curiosity. And I've been listening to your podcast for about 7 years now. And I remember that it started with that focus on organization, personal change, got into shifting how to improve K-12 education. I remember a couple of fantastic interviews with leaders in education, particularly a man that was using technology to help students succeed back many years before teachers were really using those tools as effectively as that particular person was. But now it's focusing on simply inspiring and literally cultivating curiosity, asking people, what are you curious about? And making people really think about what they want to learn more about. So why curiosity?
So that's a great question. It's got its origins in a couple of areas. As you mentioned, we started off by focusing on organization and personal change. Then we dovetailed into changes just in education when our book came out. When my co-host decided to leave to pursue her consulting business, I had a very deep few moments of thought about whether I wanted to continue talking about education, because I've been in education, Sarah, since the early 70s, first as a teacher, as you know, then educational publishing for 40 years, then as an ed consultant. And I became very disenchanted with education, how slow it moves. Glaciers move faster than changes in education.
Yes, like government.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Right. And I had done I'd done a number of shows about changes in education. It was starting to feel repetitious. We were starting to talk about ideas that people could do to move education forward. And I needed something to re-energize myself. And I think that the curiosity had its roots in one, my coach training. When I had gone through training as a coach, it's all about being curious, asking open-ended questions to clients to try to get them to open up and to think about what's blocking them. But the other impetus goes again back to the publishing days. I had led a big initiative in our company on innovation. And what we found was that, and the sales force was very good at pointing this out to us, is our programs didn't look, sound, feel any different than our competitors. We had to do something different. We had to innovate in order to get customers' attention. Well, the driver of innovation, I think, is curiosity. What's working? What's not working? How did we come to do it this way? How might we do it better? So it's just this natural questioning strategy, if you will. That's really where it came from my coach background, and then from my innovation training. And I look for guests now who have a story that has an embedded question in it. It may be explicit, it could be implicit, that they're trying to answer, and they're trying to put a dent in something, right? By asking these questions. So that's really the genesis.
I love that. And I've listened to a few of those episodes, and what I've taken from it, the thing in common isn't necessarily the word curiosity. Well, no, I guess that is what it all has in common. Regardless of the guest that you interview, there's always this common question that they're trying to answer, where they can make a difference in the environment, in education, in politics, in any area of science. I was thinking particularly about, was it Ben Goldfarb? Is that right?
Ben, yeah, go ahead.
Who authored Eager Beaver, and it's a story of how beavers impact our ecosystem and environment.
Right.
I love that episode. And I also come back to the No Longer Virtual session that you co-hosted. What was it, 23 or 24 in Chicago? Right. It was 23 in Chicago. And you hosted this whole innovation session on understanding the different kinds of innovation, division, multiplication. Right. And I still think about that. So I like that answer. That's perfect. And listeners, I would really encourage you to listen to a few of Jeff's episodes so that you can hear what we're talking about in terms of what each guest has in common, even though they seem to be very, very different, very disparate areas of interest and focus.
That's right. When people ask me about the podcast, I often say, well, the guests in the shows, the topics are very eclectic. It's not the same, from week to week to week. And I like to say what the show is about is having people think, I didn't know anything about that, or I didn't know that about this, or wow, I could use some aspect of that in my life. So it's really to encourage that type of thinking.
I appreciate that, especially because I read a couple of the books that you recommended based on your guests. And they always, what I find especially cool about LinkedIn in particular is that I'm finding areas of curiosity that I didn't think I would ever be curious about. Huh. Like many years ago, a guy named Michael, was it Durkin or Duncan, wrote a post about rust, and he's a materials scientist. And I remember realizing that's actually really interesting. I never would have imagined that that's something I would want to read about, that I would actively seek out an article on rust. And our mutual friend Milos Juvic in Serbia, Belgrade, Serbia, who again, material scientist, writes about hydrogen embrittlement in metals. And so reading about the eager beaver and reading The Feather Thief that you sent me as a gift, those are areas that I don't think I would have been curious about without a nudge. So that's why I encourage people to listen to your podcast, because those nudges help remind us to be curious.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the goal.
Awesome. Okay. So you end every episode with my one big takeaway. Why do you do that?
So this goes back a couple of years. I was actually working on the structure of the podcast, and I started including a quote from the guest at the beginning to kind of set the tone for what it was. And I thought, well, that's cool. But when the podcast would end, it would just end. The interview would end with me thanking them and them thanking me, and that was it. And that didn't seem sufficient, because one of my goals is to have listeners walk away with at least one idea. And I do that deliberately, because what I've noticed, Sarah, is that given the amount of information that we're trying to confront on a daily basis, I mean, I get 3, 4, 5, 6 Substacks in my mailbox in the morning, all having to do with events going on around us, international, United States. I can't remember everything that's in there. I want to remember 1 or 2 points that I can draw on. So that's why I end with a big reflection at the end. It's to actually encourage people to be thinking, what do I want my takeaway from this to be? I've spent 45 minutes listening to this interview with Jeff and somebody else. What's my takeaway? What am I walking away with? And what do I want to learn? Yeah, right? I try to model that. Okay. Because there could be any number of takeaways. I'm just giving you mine, but I always ask at the end, what are you thinking about?
I like that a lot. I hadn't thought about it that way, that we're consuming so much. If we're not intentionally choosing what to remember, we're not going to remember any of it.
It's a great word. It's a great word to use, because I can just find myself reading articles, and I finish them and I go, what did I just read? It really impacted me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you consistently read one particular newsletter, one particular piece of media, you consistently read it, but you don't get anything out of it, then maybe you stop reading it and find something that does have an impact.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. So when you think about the guests that you like to have, there are 2 questions. This is a 2-part question. Are there any prospective guests that you shy away from? The ones that you're just not really, you're concerned that it wouldn't be interesting, or you just don't know how it would go? Or are there any that you really would love to interview?
That's great. The first part, what comes to mind, and we touched upon this, and you actually put something in my head. This was, I think, last week, Monday, when we were talking. I'm now getting requests to interview people. They're coming in. I had 5 or 6 on Friday alone, and they all look the same. They have 3 paragraphs. They start with, I just listened to your episode with Kimberly Davis about blah, blah, blah. Or I just listened to your episode. And then the middle part is about who they are. And the 3rd paragraph is what they could bring to the podcast. This is definitely a form letter that you pointed out. It's probably AI driven, right? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes what these are, they're not so veiled attempts to have us promote something on the podcast. Those are the types of things I try to stay away from. Mm-hmm. Now, I cover a lot of books, but the books I try to position through questioning, I try to put them in the background. What we're really talking about is what drove them to write, what they were trying to communicate, and so on, versus trying to actually overtly sell the book or sell a service, whatever it is. But some people it's pretty obvious they just want me to promote a service. So I'm going to stay away from them. right?
Agreed. And the other part of that is they've never listened to your episode. You can tell. And I get the very same form letter. And at the end, where they have that list of topics that they could talk about, none of them are related to my podcast. You only have to listen to the introduction to my podcast to know that what you're saying about leadership or being a coach who does this and that to keep people happy or whatever, all the language is the same. I avoid those as well.
Yeah. I filed these under the heading of crop dusting. They're simply, they're simply, trying to see what will, how many different podcasts can I get on,
Yeah.
and
Go back to your shotgun approach, right?
yeah, exactly.
From your colleague. The other aspect of that is what I found is when I ask people to be on my podcast, I encourage them to connect with me on my various social channels. So YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, maybe Facebook, so that we can cross-pollinate. So when their episode is live, we can tag each other on it. And then they don't. I don't ever see them share the episode. And I think, why are you on my podcast? Why are you trying to get on a variety of different podcasts if you're not actually then sharing those episodes so that people can hear it?
Right.
It seems like they stop. It's kind of like my brother uses this when you cut off your marketing budget when sales are down or when the economy tanks. And he says it's like going on a road trip and not buying gas to save money.
Right.
Like, why would you make all this effort of getting onto podcasts and then not share them?
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So those are ones I try to stay away from. And the ones that interest me, the ones I go after are people who have faced a major decision in their life. And I'm really curious about how they overcame it. What was it inside of them that gave them the fortitude to challenge whatever was going on in their life at the time? And two that come to mind, I just did 2 episodes almost back to back on one was a gentleman who had had a heart attack, and his doctor told him, you have to radically change your diet or this is going to be the last conversation we're going to have. Mm-hmm. And he'd been eating a certain way his entire life, and he was now faced with having to change. The other guest was somebody who had gained or lost 700 pounds during her life through this yo-yo dieting. And finally, she had to figure out, what is it that's causing me to do this? So they're asking themselves explicit questions that they're trying to get answers to. So those are the people that I try to get on. I try to get on the show. I fell in love with one of the topics that a guest came to me with. It was about her wanting to follow almost in the footsteps of her father, who was a Holocaust survivor. It wasn't enough just to read about what he had done. She had to go to these places to trace. And we had a great discussion about why she pushed herself to literally walk the path that he had walked.
Oh.
Yeah. It was powerful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, given that, I know that you spend a lot of energy and love doing your podcast. I know I've been a guest on it. I've listened to a variety of episodes. And recently you added to that. And it's that Substack, the Walking in the Woods Substack.
Right.
And that is one of the very few newsletters that I read every week. When I see that come in, I read it. Yours and a couple of others, and that's it. So tell me, why Walking in the Woods? Is it, I'm guessing that it's similar to the reason that I do my episodes and inspiration walking on a mountain.
Sarah, this is going to sound very woo-woo. Okay.
That's okay.
Well, I should say I'm reading a book now Um, he's actually a friend of Ben Goldfarb's. The name of the book is the River Alive?
Mm.
And I thought, okay, this is going to be some spiritual fly fishing explanation about the river being alive. No, this is about the river being alive, not in how we sense aliveness as humans, but a different definition of aliveness. And that's the same way I think about walking in forests, is that there is everything in there is alive and it's connected. And when I walk in there, and this is where the woo-woo part comes in, I feel connected to the trees, especially that it's just amazing how much of the BS falls away from the day. My writing muse shows up, and all of a sudden we've figured out what it is that we want to do. And you can almost see the trees going like this. Well, we took care of that,
Our work here is
Our
done.
work here is done. That in a nutshell is why it's called Walking in the Woods, because it's so therapeutic for me. It just works.
Well, it's therapeutic for your readers too. I know you already know that because I respond sometimes. I'll say, "Oh my gosh, I really like this one because, and it really resonated with me. This is what's happening over here, and thank you."
Thank you.
So, listeners, I really encourage you to check out Jeff's Substack. There will be a link to sign up for that in the show notes associated with this podcast episode. So, I know that we are coming to the end of my portion of asking you questions, particularly about how you were able to develop that deeper clarity through those no longer virtual sessions and where you went with that, how you implemented it. So just the last question, we're talking about your target audience and what you hope to, how you hope to serve them, because that's really the ultimate goal. And that's how you identify your audience, right? What problems am I going to solve and for whom?
Right.
So what do you hope people will take away from reading your Substack?
It's very similar to the podcast, and they're linked. I always reference, in the other one. I had actually thought about calling the Substack "Cultivating Curiosity," to have them do the same thing. But basically, it's to prompt thinking. It's really it's to prompt thinking. Like the Substack I just finished that'll come out Friday is all about episodes you never heard and that I never heard. These were guests who said no in one of 3 different ways.
I can't wait to read that one.
I've done this before, and it was one of the most popular episodes I did all year. It was really talking about people who had said no, why they weren't going to be on the show. But the key was me saying to my listeners, here's why I wanted them. Here was what they were going to bring to us. If I could have secured them. So it's a way of still saying, yes, I got them on the show, even though I didn't.
Even though I didn't get them on the show.
Exactly.
I love that. Very creative.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's rotate the mic, if you will. All right, and talk about Sarah for a minute. I remember in the early days of your work, when you were just starting out as a consultant, you weren't talking about storytelling and you weren't talking about StrengthsFinder. And those 2 things were added in due time. And I'm curious how that came about and how those 2 things really exemplify your content personality type, which is live and in person.
That is such a good question. I've learned that the fastest way to prove credibility is to tell a story that demonstrates your skills and values. And I have heard people tell me they're smart multiple times. That doesn't make it true. And it definitely doesn't make it compelling. So what I realize is that when somebody shares a story that demonstrates who they are, what matters to them, what they're good at, it's far more compelling, believable, and memorable. So recently I had this opportunity to host a 4-hour workshop, a public speaking workshop with an executive leadership team for their annual retreat. And because I had their StrengthsFinder results, which basically tells me how they approach problem solving, it's referred to as a personality assessment, but I use it as a tool to understand how people think about approaching a problem or project. So I had the StrengthsFinder results for this team, and I could customize the experience for each person. I knew what kinds of stories would be meaningful and authentic to them. I knew which stories would demonstrate their talents that I could pull from them, what language they needed to hear to encourage them to speak up. And one thing I know is that by having the StrengthsFinder in there, I knew what their tolerance was for vulnerability.
Oh, good.
And when I think that's really important when you're working with a client and you want them to step out of their comfort zone, most people aren't going to just jump from their comfort zone to their stretch zone. Most people are going to stick a toe in first. And if you want them to actually make that move, you have to make it so that they're confident to do it. You have to create an environment where they feel safe to take that risk. And some people, like me, I am perfectly happy taking that risk. I will jump in with both feet head first if I need to. But I know that that's unusual. So having those strengths in front of me helped me guide them in a way that was specific to them. So when you ask how this all happened, I can tell you that when I started my business and started really shifting into this exclusive self-employment, it was all about communication, customer service training, helping people improve their communication at work and at home. When I got my StrengthsFinder certification, I went all in StrengthsFinder because it has turned out to be such an accurate tool and it comes so naturally for me. And it wasn't until I was performing at a story event that somebody said, "Why aren't you combining this?" And I realized how powerful that could be. In general, the most of my income comes from StrengthsFinder workshops, improving communication at work. But now, as I shift again, you know me, always shifting my focus and developing clarity in different ways. Now I love doing this public speaking coaching, but using the StrengthsFinder to be able to do it and pull out the right stories so that they can be really effective speakers, whether it's around the proverbial water cooler at work, at a bar, at a networking event, even at a family dinner.
Got it. So I'm glad you mentioned the word vulnerability, because when we talk about business leaders, a lot of the business leaders that I've worked with might be reluctant to tell stories. If they're making remarks in, before a meeting or whatever, it's pretty businesslike, as opposed to, there was this famous, he's probably still working, this famous coach. He wrote a book called The $1 Million Coach. His name is Bill Campbell. And he used to coach people like, the head of Apple and all these, the California tech folks. When he had his meetings on Monday morning, the staff meetings in his own company, he wouldn't start with what's going on in the business. He wanted to know what people did over the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a profound change on the atmosphere in the room. It relaxed people. So I'm curious, Sarah, about this idea of vulnerability. People who are leaders, especially who are reluctant to use it, how do you get them to put their toe in the water to start telling the personal stories?
That is such a good question, Jeff. And I always start by reminding people, one thing I know for sure is that if you want people to care about you, your career, or your business, they have to know what matters to you. They have to know why it matters to you.
Got it.
So the last time when I did this public speaking workshop, there were 2 people in that room that asked me partway through it, what's with all the storytelling? What's with all this connecting through story? It feels weird. I don't want to talk about myself. And I said, think about it this way. When I share a personal story, like I did when I first walked in here about having dinner with a friend that I hadn't seen in almost 20 years last night, because she lives near here. I was near Columbus, Ohio. And I had started the conversation by telling the story about having dinner with my friend that I went to high school and college with. And I said, did that trigger a memory for you?
There you go.
Did you suddenly remember catching up with somebody that you hadn't seen in a long time? And he kind of nodded. I said, that's not just talking about myself. It's telling you something that demonstrates who I am, what matters to me, that connection, the appreciation for a long-term relationship. And your memory came up for you, and your brain created this connection between us, your brain and your heart, because it turns out that when we experience story together, according to some researchers at City College, New York, our heartbeats actually start to fluctuate and sync. So we're connecting at a heart level. And then Paul Zak, another researcher, found that when we hear a meaningful story, it releases oxytocin and serotonin in our brains. Those are the brain chemicals responsible for feelings of love and belonging. So when we share these stories, we're connecting through our hearts and through our brains. And that's when people will do anything for you. When you develop advocates, when you become somebody that can then advocate for other people because you know what matters to them.
Got it.
So that's the leader side of things. But also when you think about career progress, I have a client who really wanted to move from her direct services role into a training position because she loves to teach and she's really good at it. And her top talents make it very clear that she's great at developing people and guiding people toward understanding of complex things. So she didn't have opportunities at work to be able to demonstrate that she would be a good teacher. So whenever she had an opportunity, whether it was during a Zoom call where they were just visiting or at networking events, internal networking events, she had crafted a story about the coaching she was doing as a swim coach and also a swim teacher. And it didn't take long for people to start to see her in a role as a people developer. And she was offered a promotion, a position. I don't remember if it was a lateral move or promotion, but she was offered a position in their learning and development department within about 6 months of starting that, sharing those personal stories.
So I've got a question here, Sarah, and you've talked about this. You've written about this and talked about it in the past. When we meet people for the first time, or when we're getting to know people, let's say at a networking event, what you've argued is don't just jump in and say, I'm a consultant that focuses on StrengthsFinder and blah, blah, blah. You want to tell a story. Where do you look for the opening? How do you get that opening to do what you just told about the HR person and her ability to weave that story into the conversation?
I love that question. One of the questions I really dislike that people ask at almost every networking event is, what do you do? That is always the best opening for telling a brief story about a client interaction or a project you're managing or something that you did recently manage and you found really satisfying. You don't share the story of bookkeeping for your business if that's not something you want to do in the future. You share the story of the thing that you like, that really demonstrates your strengths and what lights you up. So one of the things I love to do, I don't love networking events. And if I look at people's Strengths Finder results, I know which people, when I say networking event, their hands are going to start sweating and they're going to vomit a little in their mouths.
You're looking at one.
I know. I can see their Strengths Finder results and say that. Like, I know you don't love networking. I can tell from your strengths that just makes you cringe thinking about it. And I would never ask you to walk into a networking event and come home with 50 business cards. If you love to do that kind of thing, great. But that's such an arbitrary goal to set. If you're somebody who doesn't love networking, instead, I'm going to ask you to meet 3 people that you would want to keep in touch with. That's your goal, not 50. Make meaningful relationships with 3.
Yeah.
And one of the first things that I learned when I realized how uncomfortable networking made me was that if I wear something that stands out to me, a meaningful object, like the earrings that I'm wearing today that my husband gave me for my birthday, or a pair of really cool shoes that I found at a shop in Paris, right? Or even if I'm wearing black pants and I have some of my dog's fur on my leg, something that is unique to me, I will find somebody else that has something that I notice. It might be their shoes. It might be an interesting haircut. It may be, again, pet fur. One guy that I met had baby spit up on his shoulder that I'm sure he didn't know was there. And that was how I started the conversation. Noticing something like that and then talking about my object.
Right.
Right. And what I love about that is I recently met a woman named Lisa Weiss who hosts a podcast called The Object Diaries.
Yep.
And I interviewed her. And that's what she talks about, is that secret object that if somebody's just looking at you, they don't know that you're wearing your grandmother's ring. They don't know that the hat you put on was your father's, or that the shoes you're wearing came from a special road trip that you took with somebody. And having something either on you or with you gives you the kind of connection nothing else can.
When you said, I want you to meet 3 people instead of 50, that's very Rubenesque. Right?
Yes, Rubenesque.
Don't worry about the 50. Just walk away with 3, because those 3 could be great connectors for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that. So let's go. I just want to step back for a minute because I'm curious about this, where you're working with a lot of people and you're encouraging storytelling. What's the type of story that's easy for people to craft and tell? You know, if they say, "Oh, Sarah, I could never do that," you would go, "Wait, how about trying this? What's this?"
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I would, if you're talking about a personal story you want to share, I would start with an object, because everyone has a sentimental object. They may not have it with them. They may have lost it 20 years ago, but they had the copper mixing bowl that their grandmother used to make the bread in, right? So that's an easy personal one. And it's harder to find a discrete way to bring that up in certain environments, but the object story is a good one for personal stuff. When I think about work stories, though, I think about the critical theme in work stories is teamwork. That means that primary story has to include other characters.
Mm.
So in over 400 episodes of my podcast, the large majority of those are interviews. And I found that the most meaningful professional stories are the ones where my guest talks about lessons learned through the help of mentors or guides.
Mm.
I have also heard stories that were just exclusively about that person. They haven't included other people who maybe supported them, or that they succeeded in spite of, or to spite, which it's still another character. And I think that's great. There are lots of people who say, I had a teacher in middle school that told me I'd never amount to anything.
Wow.
And part of why I am where I am is because I wanted to prove them wrong.
Right.
And that tells you a lot about a person. So I really look for stories about a really good supervisor or a leader in an organization, because when you include other characters, you're demonstrating a level of humility and respect. You're talking about a team effort, being able to encourage other people by saying, oh my gosh, my team was so amazing. There was a woman on the team that did this, or this other person on the team brought this to my attention. Giving credit where credit is due. I always look out for people who don't tell those stories, who make it all about them. And as managers, they're not likely to give credit to their employees, even if they're due that credit. So I think clients that I work with, one of the best things is to come up with craft and practice about a 3-minute story about a project that might have gone a little sideways and how they managed to shift it, bring it back to a successful end, who helped them do it, and then who benefited from the result.
I'm thinking about how I end each podcast now. I give them the option to talk about a book that they've read that they want to recommend, somebody who influenced their life, or an object that's very personal to them. Nobody doesn't have an object. It's very often the default. And the one that I thought would be the book, rarely. So it's usually the object, then the person, then the book. Yeah.
Well, those are really good starts for whoever is on your podcast to have stories to craft, because you're asking them exactly the right question for them to use as a story at work, or in place of that 30-second elevator pitch. You tell that story and develop some curiosity in the person that's listening, right? Without being totally cryptic.
Yeah. And Sarah, it's fascinating to watch when they tell the story about an object, what facial expressions they have,
Agreed.
And then to bring that to their attention, because it reinforces the positive of the story.
Yes. The last time I did that exercise in a workshop where I had everybody bring or talk about an object, one woman was telling a story about a rocking chair that she had that she loved in her house because she's pretty young for a grandmother, and she loves that rocking chair because her grandchildren ask her to sit on it so they can climb up into her lap. And there was not a dry eye in that room.
I'll bet.
Men included. So you could see how it connected people to her. And afterward, I had that conversation with her. I said, Katie, did you see how your story affected the people around you?
Yeah.
You need to be aware of that, because the stories we tell say a lot about who we are.
Right. That's great. Great observation.
This was so much fun, Jeff. I loved having this conversation with you.
Yeah. I know I'm going to have other questions when we hang up, right? Because that's how my mind works. It's like the old V8 commercials, like
I could have had a V8.
I could have had a V8. Why didn't you ask Sarah that question?
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So what do you think in terms of conclusions? Do you feel like you more fully processed some of what you learned? Did anything come to light for you other than how you end your podcast asking questions like that?
I think if anything that I still have to work on is making explicit what the podcast is all about, how it's getting at curiosity. I've got that little blurb at the front, and I've got the reflection at the back end. Maybe that's enough. I don't know, but it's just, I want to make sure that because it's eclectic in terms of the stories and the guests that come on the show, I want there to be that thread, that that thread of curiosity that people go, I know what this is about. All right. These aren't just random guests coming on. They're there for a specific reason.
Well, I think you already do a pretty good job of that, but I could see how you would want to fine tune it a little bit.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, I'm thinking about that whole content personality type, the live and in person, and I noticed that all the stories I've told, I've immediately put myself back in those places of talking to a client, hosting a workshop, hearing people's stories in person, and thinking, I need to find more ways to do live and in-person conversations to build my business, because that's where I love it and it's where I shine.
Yeah, it does energize you. I can tell when I see your pictures on Instagram or on LinkedIn when you're in front of an audience that you're usually smiling and animated somehow. So do more of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So listeners, now it's your turn. I'm going to have Jeff ask you a few questions, but first I'm going to ask you a couple questions. When you think about the stories that you tell, do they demonstrate your curiosity? Do they demonstrate your motivation or ambition to learn and to grow as a human being? What is one story that you can point to, that you can craft and develop, that is 3 minutes or shorter, that you know people will understand what matters to you and how you lead? I'd love to hear from you. Jeff, what are your conclusions for our listeners?
So what I'm curious about is what came up for people as you and I were talking, because my hope, this is like when we're talking about the reflection part of the podcast, I want them to be wanting to walk away with something. So what's the takeaway? What's something that impacted you as Sarah and I were talking about how we go about doing our work, how we're thinking about our work, and how it impacts on the work that you're doing?
Perfect. Jeff, thanks again. I appreciate you.
Thank you. I'm the luckiest guy today. I got to spend 2 hours with you. So,
oh, one more thing, listeners. We just have to give a shout out to our dear friend, Neil Hughes, who is going to be taking this episode and preparing it for prime time. Jeff and I both depend so much on Neil's humor, his positive attitude, and his incredible competent talent.
I call him my tech therapist.
That's perfect. Neil, thank you.
Love you, man.
That's the time. You must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.